Hello and welcome to my talk on Reclaiming the Unborn Child's Humanity, a feminist rhetorical analysis of the National Sanctity of Human Life Day proclamations. The paper was published last year in the Women's Studies in Communication, and I am Dr. Christine Willingham. I also want to thank Elizabeth Thorpe, the editor of Communication Law Review, for inviting me to submit this talk and share my work with you today. The National Sanctity of Human Life Day proclamations were initially created by Ronald Reagan in 1984 to appease his conservative evangelical audience who had felt in his first term that he didn't really address their concerns. And so he was trying to strengthen that constituency again. Since then, every Republican president each year of their administration declared a National Sanctity of Human Life Day proclamations between 1984 and 2021. In total, there were 22 proclamations, and they cover a 37-year period. And that 37-year period coincides with the anti-abortion movement to overturn Roe. And so, although the proclamations are not single-handedly representative of that movement, they do show the twists and turns of that movement and the role of the president in affirming that ideology. Well, I'll get to this later, but interestingly, in Donald Trump's first term, he broke the pattern and did not declare a National Sanctity of Human Life Day this year. All right, so the National Sanctity of Human Life Day proclamations were part of a rhetorical effort to rename the fetus. This was a conservative movement that related back to the Roe decision to affirm a right to abortion. In Roe, the majority decision written by Justice Harry Blackmun recalled that the Wade argument was that if the fetus was actually a person under the 14th Amendment, then the fetus would be protected by that amendment. And Roe acknowledged in their arguments that if personhood could be established, then the Roe case and the right to abortion would collapse. So this rhetorical renaming is significant and is part of that effort to achieve the 14th Amendment rights for the fetus. It was supplemented with a significant visual rhetoric. You might be familiar with fetal imagery photos that show babies sucking their thumb, having hiccups, or these other types of things. I won't really be going into that today. It's a whole other paper, but that was a significant part of this movement as well. So proclamations and executive actions are an understudied form of presidential rhetoric. In 2025, that might change in that we've seen unprecedented use of executive action in this administration, but up until this point, not a lot of scholarship has been done. The National Sanctity of Human Life Day proclamations were notable because of their effort to participate and legitimate a movement that went against what the current state of affairs was. So this observance not only was a presidential proclamation, but it was adopted by churches, and so gained additional strength through the rituals of including it in a Sunday Mass and prayer observances. The presidents used the proclamations to solidify their coalitions and to affirm their policy agenda for each of their administrations. And then you'll see here in President Trump's first day, in 2025, instead of the National Sanctity of Human Life Day proclamations, which he had done in his first term, that his main policy goals were to make sure the flag was at full staff for his inauguration day because it had been running at half staff because of the death of former President Jimmy Carter. 2 proclamations related to the immigration crisis, securing the southern border and acknowledging that the protecting states against the invasion. And then the last one was granting pardons of January 6th participants. So we can see the policy agenda has shifted a little bit in that regard. So the National Sanctity of Human Life Day proclamations provide this longitudinal view of an evolving ideology and how it gets used for political purposes. The role of presidential ceremonial rhetoric and the importance of presidential ceremonial rhetoric in shifting the debate from women's liberty to fetal rights. And in fact, women are almost invisible within these narratives that I'm going to present to you today for the proclamations. We see how the ideology has changed with this excerpt from the Dobbs versus Jackson Hole Women's Health Center. The right to abortion, according to the Dobbs majority decision, destroys what Roe termed as potential life, because the law that was in the case that they were ruling on declared life to be an unborn human being. So again, that rhetorical move gets adopted and integrated into our legal arguments. So in this regard, presidents serve a ceremonial role in America's civil religion, and I'm going to break that down for you in just a bit here. So in that ceremonial role, the president can be priest or prophet, depending on what the policy agenda is that the president is looking for. So Robert Bellah in 2005 proposed that there is an American civil religion, and that this civil religion explains the national identity and its relationship to Christianity. It is a secularized version of Christianity, kind of meant to be a broad strokes of all the different versions and interpretations of Christianity, and it's expressed by a set of beliefs, symbols, and ritual. So as expressed in the National Sanctity of Human Life Day proclamations, in this civil religion, America, and America is used, our country, I will back up for a second. The country is the United States of America. Sometimes we might say United States, sometimes we might say America and American. But in the proclamations, America is used in a very purposeful way to signal a God-chosen nation for fulfilling God's destiny, right? And these are anchored by the founding documents, which are treated by sacred texts. And the founding fathers are a little like the apostles of this civil religion. And so they get called back to time and time again in order to reinforce and support the claims that America is God's chosen nation. So in this civil religion, the president is our moral leader. He is both man and office. I use the term he. Hopefully it'll someday be a she or a they, but historically they have always been he, so we'll use that pronoun. And the election is not only an election of a leader, but it is ordaining the moral leader of the country during that term. So the president not only conveys his own authority of whatever type of leader he may or may not be and what he proposes to be, but he gains authority and legitimization through the office itself. Coles in 2002 noted that the president most often adopts a priestly role when he wants to legitimate government and preserve the status quo, but can adopt the role of the prophet when he seeks to challenge the status quo and urge a misguided nation to improve the misgivings or the things that we haven't been doing well, and to get back to our moral grounding. This is similar to what Perry and Giles calls collective memory. So in collective memory, it's the use of familiar symbols of the past to justify the present. And so and these use of collective memory and symbols of our past cultivate a shared identity between the speaker and the audience. And it's also a purposeful persuasive attempt which may go unrecognized as a persuasive attempt. It's in ceremonial speech, it's delivered at an occasion, it's not deliberative, it doesn't get debated or alternative set of facts being presented, and so it is accepted openly, generally by its audience. The president's office confers the authority of the office onto the president's interpretation of this shared past. And so when we talk about that shared past, we can say that there's only one way to interpret what the Declaration of Independence is, but the scholarship says there are many ways that we can think about what the founding of our nation is. And secondly, according to Hart in 2003, using collective memory and recalling these symbolisms of the past increases the emotional tenor of the text. So the proclamations, even though there were 22 of them and went through 4 different presidents, they remarkably had a similar structure. They began with America's founding, its great nation, and the great exceptionalism that we exhibit within the world. It would then turn to its relationship to Christianity and God and how we are indebted to God for our existence. And then finally, it would talk about the ways that government is not punishing women or trying to take away rights, but rather government is the judicious embodiment of God. So it is government's job to live out that moral authority for the U.S. So invoking this collective memory, we seek to establish the United States as ordained by God to fulfill his will. So it's not that we have our own will as a democratic nation, but we are here in order to fulfill this greater effort in that way. And in that context, the National Sanctity of Human Life Day proclamations invoke the sacred texts of America's civil religion, which are the Declaration of Independence, the U.S. Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. And then occasionally, as we'll see later in the talk, they also invoke quotes from different founding fathers. So the American exceptionalism argument that we see going on in these proclamations invoke a 19th century meaning of what it is to be American. Basil and Kay in 2004 argued that in the abortion debate in the latter half of the 19th century, which happened also amid a wave of immigration, that American was constructed as being native-born, white, civilized, Christian, and Protestant. And so anyone who did not fulfill those particular elements were not American, right? And they were something else. So the presidents constructed and bolstered a national identity reminiscent of this 19th century definition of American. It added a new layer, which was a reverence for human life. So if you were someone who did not revere human life in the way that it's being defined in these proclamations, then you were not American. You were, again, you were an outsider to our national identity. And and so safeguarding this identity was not only important, but it was a civic duty, and it was the duty given to us by God. And so it carries that weight. Abortion, as it was constructed in these proclamations, was a national tragedy and antithetical to America's history, heritage, and concepts of justice. It was compared to the nation's worst atrocities. So abortion, in the way it was framed in the National Sanctity of Human Life Day proclamations, was equivalent to slavery, racial segregation, and marginalization of people with disabilities. Now, the part about people with disabilities is noteworthy in relation to the debate about abortion. And that is because one of the justifications for abortion is fetal anomalies. And so including them in the same category, their marginalization in the same category as slavery and racial segregation, helps to continue to solidify that argument about why abortion shouldn't happen. Because we could note that what is not mentioned here as being an atrocity of the U.S. is the marginalization of women, the marginalization of people in the LGBTQIA plus community, and the marginalization of people who are not Christian. So it was only some marginalizations that are a travesty and not others. All right. So government's duty then is to protect our national identity, our national values that are anchored by this reverence for human life. And in that depiction of the government's duty, Bush, HW, and GW invoked Thomas Jefferson's quote, "Care of human life and happiness, not their destruction, is the purpose of government." This quote is also noteworthy. It was picked up by a number of anti-abortion groups, and you will see that in their rhetoric. But the quote is oddly came out of a minor letter. And there's no indication that Jefferson actually linked this description of caring for life to caring for an unborn fetus. So the quote comes from the response to the Republicans of Washington County, Maryland, upon Jefferson's retirement from the presidency. The letter used the word retirement. That's why I'm using the word retirement. We don't typically think of a president retiring in modern context, and so the Washington County Republicans were praising Jefferson and his skill for avoiding our entry into the war between Britain and France. And so Jefferson's quote is actually about not going to war, and that the president's job is to care for life and not its destruction. And so it had nothing to do with reproduction in that way. So the next theme is this idea of a beneficent Christian God. So this is not your Old Testament God that we have to fear him and he will strike us down if we are bad. It is when we do things that God wants us to do, we will prosper, we will find happiness, and life will be good. And so it is this depiction of God that is integrated throughout the proclamations. And then when we see all presidential proclamations are signed by, in the year of our Lord, insert whatever year the proclamation is, and the independence of the United States of America of independence. So including these two at the end of the proclamations, again lends gravitas to the argument that this is not just some guy who wakes up someday and says a bunch of words. These are very ceremonial, important words that are endorsed by these various themes. And then we see, again, beneficent Christian God in these quotes from the Declaration of Independence. So our rights that are in the Declaration are not developed from men. It's not an agreement of a democratic people to say we're going to live by these rules. We've thought about it. These are the rules that are important to us. This is how we want to live. But instead, these rights are a gift from the Creator. And so by being a gift from the Creator, they cannot be altered, they cannot be adapted, and they cannot be interpreted. And again, this signals back to Roe as being, having the right to privacy as being interpreted from the rights that are spelled out in the Bill of Rights. The proclamations also, George W. Bush reminds us that God comes before science. So science is not all-knowing truth. Science is only an approximation of truth, but God and our values from God will help inform and guide us in the way that we use science. And in the proclamations, the scientific terms that the medical community would use to discuss a pregnancy, such as first trimester, fetus, zygote, those are replaced with these human terms to again humanize the fetus as an unborn child. So we see babies, infants, preborn children. Here is a graphic of a book that was popular in the anti-abortion movement called The Secret Life of the Unborn Child. Again, conveying that message that the unborn child is separate from the mother, the unborn child has a life, and already is entitled to live that life regardless of what else might be there. Interestingly, though, they invoke the authority of science to show the biological continuation of life. And they point back to the previous definitions of human life that looked at, Aristotle called it had an ensoulment theory. The Catholic Church at some point had a theory that when quickening happened, that was when the baby became a soul and a human and started to have agency and cognition then. But in these proclamations, life is from conception until natural death. And they always use the term natural death because that is also a critique on arguments for euthanasia, which is a side topic. And so humans then are made in the image of God, and they have immeasurable worth and potential. So there is not ever in this argument space for us to determine otherwise, because God has already predetermined that. And so this argument sets up a hierarchy of rights. An unborn child's right to life is a divine right, a right by the Creator, and so it cannot be interrupted. And then women's empowerment or bodily control over her body is just a secular right. Apparently God never gave us that right. So when we think about, and Dobbs uses this in their decision making, what they call competing rights and how we manage them, then the fetus's unborn right to life always supersedes a woman's secular right to control her body. So the proclamations set this up when I mentioned the part of ritual and ceremony. The proclamations talk about, convey a sense of mourning for all the lives that are lost due to abortion. Trump and Reagan both counted in their proclamations how many lives had been lost. So Reagan first did this in 1984 with an estimation of 15 million human lives that are lost and would update that. The Bushes decided not to emphasize that part and didn't include that in theirs. And then Trump brought it back with 50 million innocent lives being lost. And then Trump expands onto the idea that we've lost an entire generation due to abortion in this counting. And there's no reference to where these numbers come from, just to be clear on that. So it's not like they took information from the Guttmacher organization about how many abortions they estimate happen in a year and added them all up and totaled them. They don't give them. But anyway, so but Trump asked us to listen to the silence by a lost generation. And then Reagan says that, speculates that all these 50 million unborn children might have been adults who heal the sick, feed the poor, or make peace beyond nations. And so not only do we have the loss of a size of population, but we have a loss of all these future contributions that those individuals would have contributed to our world. All right. When women are spoken of, it is more in a protectionist argument. So in general, women are kind of not in the proclamations. That is not the focus of the proclamations, but when they're discussed, women's anguish is discussed. And so it's the president's duty to not only relieve women's anguish, but to protect them from an abortion industry and a social system that drives women and girls to abortion. And so the president's duty then is to save women from exploitation and emptiness in this regard. So then government's role in this, again, is that proxy of doing God's will. So government has a solemn duty to make sure that we maintain our national identity and the values that we uphold. And but reverence for life is now one of those values. So if we were going to make a new slogan underneath the flag, it might be liberty, reverence for life, and what other values that you might say. Okay? And so the president in this role is our moral leader and is acting in that regard to make sure that we are keeping to our values. The president's also in the proclamations put forward this idea of an idealized future, right? And this is important because it helps to with the audience to show that it's not just that we're against something, but we're for something. And so we're working towards and we're moving towards what this idealized future is. And so that future is one in where Christian beliefs are institutionalized in our law. It is one where American exceptionalism is restored, and the state controls the terms of reproduction. And so we can see some of these themes, again, in our current context in 2025. And democratic government is not just our elected leaders, but as a democracy, the people are part of our democratic government. So the president's call on the people in these proclamations to make sure that they are doing their part to preserve and protect human life. Anti-abortion activists are characterized by the president as compassionate Americans and warriors in this effort to bring the United States back to its former glory. It's important for these compassionate Americans to defend the weak, the silent, and the endangered. And George W. Bush complimented them on their selflessness and compassion. He also mentioned in this regard ways that they contributed and volunteered time to crisis pregnancy centers, even though crisis pregnancy centers have been criticized for not giving you all the information that one might need for a pregnancy in crisis, and the beauties of adoption, and that even though there are also critiques that adoption is not always a perfect solution either. So women were courageous only when they chose life, only when they chose to bear their children. They also, in the proclamations, acknowledged the contributions of secular professionals. And we see this in the protecting the conscience exemptions for professionals and health providers. So scientists, healthcare providers, judges, elected officials, and social work professionals who support reverence for life are also to be commended. And so they are just as much a part of this evolution and this movement as the presidents and our elected officials are. So the final part of the proclamations then is to show that the presidents have actually made progress. The proclamations at the time when Reagan first initiated them, because Roe was the decision of the land and said a right to abortion was guaranteed, there wasn't much a president could do to satisfy their conservative Christian audiences, but a proclamation was in their toolbox, and so they could do that. As they started to make progress, so Reagan's initial progress was that he asked Congress to declare humanity of the unborn child. That movement didn't go anywhere. But as the proclamations go on in time, we see where they become more successful. So in George W. Bush, he manages to get 3 acts proposed and passed through Congress. One is the Born Alive Infant Protection Act. That was based on the assumption that some fetuses were being born alive in abortions and then were being killed by the medical providers or left to die. And so in this scenario, medical providers are told that they must do everything they can to resuscitate the fetus if it's born alive in the act of abortion. The Partial Birth Abortion Ban Act was to ban a particular abortion procedure that medical providers did not call partial birth, but it was a way of inducing contractions that would help to deliver the fetus in that way. And then Unborn Victims of Violence Act was an act where if a pregnant woman was killed, murdered, then the person could be held on 2 murder charges, both for her and for the fetus. And so, understandably, that would be a way of doing that, but in defining the unborn as someone that you can deliver a murder charge to someone else, then helps to strengthen that unborn child definition. So Trump had the most accomplishments, not necessarily because he was a president beyond what the other presidents could do, but more it shows the strength of the movement at the point in time that Donald Trump becomes president in his first administration. So he was able to extend the conscientious objectors exemptions for abortion with Supreme Court cases and Hobby Lobby and Little Sisters of the Poor that protected employers from offending their religious beliefs by extending birth control under the Affordable Care Act requirements. He expanded Title X limitations by enacting the Mexico City policy, where you don't provide federal funds to any organization that talks about abortion, that provides abortion, that mentions abortion in any way. And this was a realized goal that had long been held by anti-abortion activists of defunding Planned Parenthood. And so Planned Parenthood loses Title X funds during this period of time. He also advanced the anti-abortion movement globally with the Geneva Consensus Declaration, wherein he had 40 other countries sign on to a declaration that internationally there was no right to abortion, that you cannot claim an international right to abortion because it would offend cultural sensibilities and values and national identities of particular countries, and so we couldn't use that as a right. He also appointed more than 200 federal judges and his three Supreme Court justices, which helped to have Dobbs overturn Roe, which was one of the major goals of the anti-abortion movement. All right. So in conclusion, the National Sanctity of Human Life Day proclamations were a significant rhetorical effort that not only helped to build coalitions and legitimize the anti-abortion movement with the authority of the president and the president's office, but it also shows exemplifies the trajectory of the movement as it moves forward. We see the success of the movement in the terms being adopted into laws and policy and Supreme Court decisions. So the life, conception to natural death, symbolized by the unborn child, it validated God's moral authority over secular beliefs or secular belief systems and ways that we might find consensus through a way that would be non-Christian. That the U.S. has a covenant with God. God chose the U.S. to civilize the world, to be a powerhouse, but that requires that we fulfill God's destiny, and so that covenant comes through. And abortion is that transgression against God and a failure of government. So for government to continue to allow such a tragedy of stunning dimensions, as Ronald Reagan called it, is an affront to our national identity. So now the Roe is overturned, and President Trump did not do a National Sanctity of Human Life Day proclamation in 2025. But we still see that now that abortion has been turned to the states. Currently, as of April 2nd, 2025, only 20 states in the U.S. are ranked by the Guttmacher organization as being protective of abortion. So the movement so we're at a historical period in time where we are back to 1960 and fighting in the legislative houses for a right to abortion and hoping that at some point we'll find another Supreme Court decision that will affirm a right to abortion. Thank you for listening and attending my talk. I appreciate it very much.